The name Imperial Guard evokes an image of unshakable loyalty and elite martial prowess within the Japanese military tradition. These were the chosen soldiers, entrusted with the personal protection of the emperor, and their history stretched back through centuries of Japanese warfare. When these formidable units were deployed to face the United States Marine Corps in the brutal Pacific Theater, the ensuing clashes were destined to become legendary tests of will and doctrine. The assumption held by Japanese commanders was that the Guard's superior spirit and rigorous training would simply overwhelm the American defenses. This confidence was rooted in decades of success against less equipped and less determined adversaries across Asia, particularly in their rapid and brutal campaigns through Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. The psychological weight of the Imperial Guard's reputation was a formidable weapon in itself, designed to terrify and demoralize the enemy before the first shot was even fired. However, the Pacific Island battles presented an entirely new and unforeseen paradigm of combat, one where spiritual conviction collided violently with cold, industrial might. The Marines they faced were not colonial garrisons or poorly supplied militias, they were a professional, well-equipped, and fiercely motivated fighting force. The initial engagements quickly exposed the dangerous disconnect between the Guard's celebrated battlefield philosophy and the grim reality of modern defensive warfare. Against the sustained, overwhelming volume of American automatic fire, the traditional, frontal assault methods of the Imperial Guard proved tragically ineffective. Their rigid obedience to preset plans and the insistence on a glorious, decisive charge cost them catastrophic losses without achieving any sustainable breakthroughs. The Marine lines, anchored by superior logistics and the prodigious output of American factories, were designed to absorb shock and instantly retaliate with disproportionate force. This fundamental mismatch of material resources and tactical philosophy is the very core of why the Imperial Guard's most determined efforts ultimately failed to break the stubborn Marine defenses. The Pacific became the crucible where the myth of invincible, spirit-driven infantry was finally shattered by the devastating efficiency of American industrial-age warfare. The Japanese soldiers' willingness to die for the emperor was undeniable, yet it could not overcome the sheer number of bullets, shells, and bombs the Marines possessed. Every attempted breach of the Marine perimeter was met with a wall of lead and explosive steel, transforming the Guard's famous charges into nothing more than mass casualties. The U.S. Marine Corps possessed a distinct and decisive advantage in organic firepower that fundamentally dictated the outcome of every defensive battle. A Marine rifle squad was equipped with the semi-automatic M1 Garand, a weapon capable of delivering a far greater sustained volume of accurate fire than the bolt-action Arisaka used by the average Imperial Guard soldier. The 8-round EN block clip of the Garand allowed an individual Marine to rapidly engage multiple targets, turning the defense into a veritable hail of continuous fire. Furthermore, the integration of light machine guns, such as the Browning automatic rifle or BAR, at the squad level provided a crucial base of suppressive fire. The BAR, firing the powerful .30-06 cartridge, could rip through jungle foliage and suppress entire enemy avenues of approach with its heavy-hitting capability. Every Marine platoon was a self-contained unit of immense killing power, meticulously trained to use interlocking fields of fire for maximum defensive efficiency. The Japanese Imperial Guard, relying heavily on shock and bayonet charges, frequently underestimated the sheer density of lead they would encounter upon closing with American positions. Their light machine guns were often less numerous, had lower rates of fire, and required more frequent reloading, creating fatal gaps in their own suppressive fire. The Marine Corps tactical doctrine emphasized a layered defense, where the frontline troops were supported by heavy machine guns, mortars, and artillery positioned just behind the immediate defensive perimeter. This meant that even if the first line of Marines was momentarily compromised, the supporting weapons could immediately saturate the breach zone with devastating fire. The American ability to call in immediate, precision mortar fire from integrated units was a constant, terrifying deterrent to any large-scale Japanese troop concentrations. In contrast, the Imperial Guard often struggled with reliable and timely indirect fire support, a shortfall that proved lethal during sustained engagements. This superior organization of firepower, from the individual weapon to the company's heavy weapons platoon, created a truly impenetrable defensive barrier. The Marines did not merely repel the Guard, they systematically shredded the attacking formations, a testament to the devastating output of American small arms technology and its tactical application. The technological superiority was amplified by the doctrine of aggressive and rapid counterfire, ensuring that every enemy movement was met with an immediate and disproportionate response. The Imperial Japanese Army's doctrine was deeply rooted in the concept of Seishin Kaoku, or spiritual training, which heavily influenced their suicidal banzai charges. This attack philosophy prioritized the moral and spiritual commitment of the soldier over the material reality of the battlefield. The banzai charge was intended to achieve a decisive breakthrough through sheer ferocity and surprise, shattering the enemy's will to fight in one massive, terrifying rush. However, against the prepared defenses of the U.S. Marines, this predictable, human wave assault became a tactical liability rather than an asset. The Marines, well drilled and equipped for sustained combat, were trained to withstand the initial shock of a charge and deliver devastating concentrated fire into the densely packed formations. The predictable nature of the attack meant American troops could pre-register their artillery, mortars, and machine guns on likely assembly areas and assault routes. As soon as the Japanese emerged from the jungle or their defensive positions, they were immediately hit by a curtain of explosive and kinetic energy. The charges were often launched at night, which the Japanese believed would provide cover, but the Marines countered this with flares and pre-cut fields of fire, turning the darkness into a trap. American machine gunners simply held their trigger, sweeping their weapons back and forth across the densely populated killing zones. The Japanese Imperial Guard leadership was often rigidly committed to this doctrine, even when it became clear that the charges were failing with horrific casualty rates. There was a cultural reluctance to break from the established, honor-bound offensive strategy, preventing a shift to more flexible, infiltration-based tactics that might have proved more effective. The Marines learned quickly to conserve their fire until the Japanese were within effective range, maximizing the destructive impact of every bullet and shell fired. The banzai attack demanded that the Japanese overcome insurmountable fire superiority using only courage and the bayonet, a sacrifice that industrial warfare simply rendered obsolete. These doctrinal failures meant that the Imperial Guard, for all its bravery, was essentially throwing itself against an impenetrable and calculating steel wall. The charges were often the final, desperate act of a commander unable to conceive of a retreat or a change in strategy, dooming their men in a futile effort. The underlying and most decisive factor in the Japanese failure was the overwhelming, industrial logistical superiority of the United States. Warfare in the Pacific was defined not just by the soldiers on the line, but by the endless stream of material and supplies flowing from the American home front. The Marine Corps defensive positions could be continually resupplied with fresh ammunition, food, water, and medical aid, sustaining them through weeks of continuous, high-intensity fighting. This meant that a Marine defending a foxhole had the confidence that his reserve of ammunition would never run dry, allowing him to maintain continuous suppressive fire. The Japanese Imperial Guard, in stark contrast, operated on what was often a threadbare and collapsing supply line, severely constrained by American submarine warfare and air superiority. Once an Imperial Guard unit was committed to an island battle, their capacity to sustain the fight depended entirely on the limited supplies they could carry with them. A lack of fresh food and clean water quickly led to malnutrition and debilitating diseases, significantly degrading the fighting capacity and endurance of the troops. Critical shortages of heavy weapons ammunition meant that their supporting artillery and mortars could only fire sparingly, never achieving the sustained barrages necessary to disrupt the marine defenses. The logistical difference manifested tragically when Japanese units were forced to launch their final attacks out of desperation, driven by starvation and depleted resources rather than a tactical opportunity. American engineers, known as CBs, rapidly constructed airfields and port facilities, transforming captured islands into forward supply bases almost overnight. This allowed the marine lines to be reinforced with heavy machinery, tanks, and fresh troops with unbelievable speed, compounding the Japanese dilemma. The Japanese, having to rely on small, nocturnal transport runs or human carriers, simply could not compete with the sheer volume of war material the Americans could project across the vast Pacific Ocean. Every Japanese defensive counterattack was thus a desperate, time-limited gambit, while the marine defense was a patiently built, inexhaustible fortress of steel and supplies. The American logistical machine ensured that the marine lines were never critically depleted, solidifying their position against even the most determined and spiritual assaults. The ability of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps to call upon overwhelming air and naval gunfire support provided a flexible, mobile wall of fire that the Imperial Guard could never breach. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers positioned offshore acted as massive, floating artillery platforms, capable of delivering shells weighing hundreds of pounds over long distances with surprising accuracy. This pre-invasion and in-battle bombardment had the power to flatten entire sections of jungle and pulverize fortified positions before the marine infantry even advanced. Crucially, this naval firepower could be directed instantly against any large-scale Japanese counterattack or troop concentration that threatened the marine lines. The Japanese rarely had comparable naval support, and what little they had was often quickly driven away or sunk by the superior American fleet. Coupled with this naval power was the absolute dominance of American air power, with Marine and Navy aircraft constantly patrolling the skies. Fighter bombers could be on station within minutes of a request from the front line, delivering precision bombing and strafing runs directly onto Japanese assault forces. The Imperial Guard was therefore exposed to a three-dimensional attack, fire from the ground, from the sea, and from the air, creating a lethal operating environment. Any tactical success the Japanese achieved by penetrating the initial marine perimeter was instantly negated by the ability of the Marines to call in close air support to saturate the breach. Japanese troops were forced to fight from deep, fortified caves and bunkers to survive the endless bombardment, which in turn restricted their mobility and offensive capability. This air and naval superiority allowed the Marines to commit fewer troops to the immediate line, knowing that any serious threat could be countered by an unimaginable volume of external fire. The Japanese soldiers often described the experience as fighting the entire American nation, feeling the crushing weight of their industrial capacity raining down upon them. The coordination between the Marine ground forces and their air-sea brethren was meticulously trained and executed, turning every defensive action into a combined arms masterclass. It was this relentless, integrated fire support system that transformed the Marine defensive line from a mere row of foxholes into an utterly unbreakable wall of ordnance. The Japanese Imperial Guard often fought on terrain that was initially chosen and prepared by their own forces, but the Marines quickly adapted to counter those very advantages. The Japanese defensive strategy evolved from simple trenches to complex, interlocking networks of subterranean tunnels, reinforced concrete pillboxes, and natural cave systems. These fortifications were designed for defense in depth, intended to force the Americans into costly, slow, attritional warfare rather than a decisive battle of maneuver. However, the Marines proved exceptionally adept at neutralizing these positions through specialized tactics and engineering resources. The key to the Marine defense was not simply holding a static line, but using the terrain and their own hasty fortifications to channel and destroy the attacking forces. They utilized portable steel matting, concertina wire, and deeply dug foxholes, all strategically positioned to create overlapping fields of machine gun and rifle fire. The Marines meticulously cleared fields of fire in front of their positions, removing vegetation that could offer cover to the Imperial Guard during an advance. When the Japanese attacked, they were forced into pre-sighted killing zones, where every square inch of ground had been measured for maximum artillery and mortar effectiveness. The use of mines and booby traps further complicated the Japanese advance, slowing their momentum and forcing them to commit valuable time and manpower to clearing operations. Marine engineers quickly built connecting trenches and communication lines behind the front, ensuring that the defensive perimeter remained cohesive and easily reinforced. The Japanese Imperial Guard, relying on rapid movement and shock, found their assaults completely stalled by these methodical and unyielding defensive preparations. Their attempts to bypass the strong points were often anticipated by the flexible Marine doctrine, which emphasized local counterattacks and the rapid shifting of fire support. The Marines effectively turned the rugged island terrain, the coral outcroppings, volcanic rock, and dense jungle, into an extension of their own fortified line. This combination of superior, field-engineered positions and an innate understanding of combined arms defense made the Marine lines impervious to the traditional Imperial Guard assaults. A significant weakness contributing to the Imperial Guard's inability to break the Marine lines was the fundamental rigidity and inflexibility of their tactical thinking. Japanese military doctrine placed an enormous emphasis on following the battle plan to the letter, a trait that hampered their ability to adapt to the fluid, chaotic nature of the Pacific battlefields. Field commanders were often hesitant to deviate from their initial orders, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of tactical failure or insurmountable enemy strength. This meant that when a banzai charge or a coordinated counterattack began to falter under Marine fire, the Japanese forces would continue the doomed effort until completely annihilated. The Marines, by contrast, operated under a doctrine that encouraged initiative and decentralized decision-making among junior officers and non-commissioned officers. A Marine fire team leader or squad leader was empowered to make immediate adjustments to his unit's defensive posture or to initiate small-scale counter-flanking movements. This fluid, adaptive defense allowed the Marines to quickly reinforce weak points and exploit Japanese hesitation or confusion in the heat of battle. The Imperial Guard was often trained to focus on a single, decisive point of attack, which the Marines could easily identify and reinforce with their prodigious fire support. When an assault was stopped, the Japanese command structure struggled to reorganize the surviving forces for a secondary, more complex maneuver or a tactical withdrawal. The failure to rapidly integrate combined arms assets, like tanks, mortars, and infantry, was another critical operational gap that favored the versatile Marines. Japanese tanks were often used piecemeal or committed to the attack without adequate infantry support, making them easy targets for Marine anti-tank weapons. The rigid hierarchy and delayed communication within the Japanese command structure meant that local tactical successes could not be rapidly exploited or turned into strategic gains. The Marine Corps training emphasized solving problems on the spot, using available resources, and maintaining communication under fire, a system that proved superior to the Guard's centralized control. The Imperial Guard's adherence to the doctrine of victory or death meant that adaptation was seen as weakness, a philosophical flaw that became a tactical death sentence against the modern American defense. The unsung heroes in establishing the unbreakable Marine lines were the Marine combat engineers, who brought a level of mobility and defensive construction that the Japanese could not match. These engineers were fully integrated into the frontline units, not simply relegated to rear-echelon construction tasks like their Japanese counterparts often were. The Marines' success in holding positions was heavily reliant on the engineers' immediate ability to lay minefields, construct intricate wire obstacles, and quickly fortify captured ground. Their rapid construction of machine gun emplacements and mortar pits ensured that a hastily taken position could be instantly transformed into a formidable defensive strongpoint. Critically, the engineers were also demolition experts, providing the offensive capability necessary to break the Japanese defensive fortifications that the Imperial Guard relied upon. The Marines understood that a purely static defense would eventually be worn down, so they consistently sought to eliminate the Japanese ability to launch attacks from their deep bunkers. Engineers armed with satchel charges, pole charges, and flamethrowers were the specialized answer to the concrete and coral strongholds of the Imperial Guard. This ability to systematically destroy the Japanese firing points, one by one, meant that the Marine defense was constantly tightening its grip, reducing the enemy's operational space. The Japanese forces, while skilled at digging in, lacked the heavy equipment and standardized demolition training to rapidly dismantle the reinforced positions that the Marines established. The American ability to quickly construct and clear obstacles meant that the flow of logistics and reinforcements to the Marine lines was seldom impeded. Furthermore, the engineers played a vital role in recovering damaged Marine equipment, especially tanks and amphibious tractors, ensuring that heavy support remained in the fight. Their presence instilled a confidence in the infantry that no matter how deep the Japanese dug, the Marines had the specialized tools to root them out and secure the battlefield. The engineers' dual role, building and destroying, was a force multiplier that made the Marine perimeter both aggressively offensive and structurally impregnable. The Battle of Peleliu serves as one of the most vivid and brutal case studies illustrating why even the most elite Japanese forces, including elements of the Imperial Guard's lineage or similar elite divisions, failed. The Japanese defense on Peleliu, under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, represented the final evolution of their defensive doctrine, shifting from the suicidal beach defense to a deep, integrated defense of the island's formidable Amerbragol mountain. This defense in depth utilized over 500 interconnected caves and heavily fortified positions, turning the entire ridge system into a massive, interlocking fortress. The Marines, assaulting the island, faced a complex tactical environment where every Japanese attack was launched from unexpected positions within this subterranean network. The Imperial Guard's elite mindset was not enough to overcome the sustained, methodical American approach to siege warfare that was forced upon them. The Marines adapted by shifting their focus from frontal assaults to using flamethrowers, bulldozers, and demolition teams in a relentless campaign of cave cleaning. Each Japanese attack, even those launched by the most dedicated troops, was met by a pre-planned, coordinated barrage of artillery and heavy machine gun fire aimed at the exit points of the caves. The Americans established a continuous defensive line, which, though constantly under threat, was never decisively broken due to the immediate availability of reinforcements and casualty evacuation. Japanese counterattacks were always starved of logistical support and were often launched with troops who were already suffering from exhaustion and a lack of basic supplies. The battle became a protracted struggle of attrition, where the Japanese goal was simply to inflict maximum casualties, not to break the line and achieve a strategic victory. The Marine ability to maintain their forward momentum, however slow, while continuously resupplying their troops and evacuating their wounded, proved the ultimate difference. Peleliu's bloody ridges stand as a stark monument to the fact that defensive genius, no matter how spiritually driven, cannot overcome endless material advantage and relentless combined arms tactics. The Japanese Imperial Guard's determination was unquestionable, yet their courage could not manufacture the shells, the clean water, or the plasma needed to sustain their fighting force. The disparity in medical support and the resulting difference in battlefield morale was a crucial, often overlooked factor that contributed to the Marine line's unbreakability. The U.S. Marine Corps placed a high priority on casualty evacuation and immediate medical treatment, ensuring that a high percentage of wounded soldiers returned to fight or at least survived. Marine Corpsmen, operating with incredible bravery directly on the front lines, were a visible, constant symbol of the commitment to saving every single life. This guaranteed access to prompt and effective medical care profoundly bolstered the fighting spirit of the Marine defenders, who knew they would not be abandoned if wounded. The Japanese Imperial Guard, conversely, operated under a doctrine that essentially precluded retreat and minimized the value of medical resources for combat effectiveness. Wounded Japanese soldiers often had little to no hope of proper evacuation or surgery, leading to inevitable death from treatable wounds or infection. This lack of medical safety net created a desperate, all-or-nothing mindset among the Japanese troops, but it also meant that every casualty was a permanent loss of fighting strength. As the battle wore on, the sight of wounded comrades left to die or encouraged to commit suicide further eroded the long-term morale and physical capability of the Japanese forces. The American lines, though suffering heavy losses, maintained a resilient structure because their wounded were immediately replaced by fresh, well-rested troops. The seamless system of medical evacuation and replacement ensured that the Marine line's capacity to deliver firepower remained constant and undiminished. The Japanese attempts to break the Marine lines were therefore fighting against a regenerative, self-repairing enemy that could sustain continuous combat operations. The difference in morale was not in initial courage, but in the sustained psychological stamina provided by a system that valued the individual soldier's life and longevity. The commitment to preserving manpower was a tactical and moral asset that the Imperial Guard, constrained by its rigid code of honor and sacrifice, simply could not afford to match. The Marine Corps' success was not due to static, unchanging defensive doctrine, but rather its remarkable speed in learning and adapting to the Japanese deep defense tactics. Initial encounters, such as on Guadalcanal, were costly learning experiences that taught the Marines the fatal flaws of underestimating Japanese persistence and commitment to fortified positions. After these early lessons, Marine tactics evolved rapidly to emphasize overwhelming firepower, pre-planned artillery concentrations, and a patient, methodical reduction of strong points. The Marines perfected the use of the blowtorch and corkscrew method, combining flamethrowers to neutralize cave entrances with demolition charges to seal them permanently. They learned to stop chasing individual attackers and instead focused on eliminating the communication and command nodes of the Japanese defensive network. The concept of a flexible defense, where forward fighting positions were intentionally porous to channel the attack into pre-sighted kill zones, became standard procedure. The integration of tank support directly into the infantry assault became a core Marine advantage, using the tank's heavy guns and armor to suppress Japanese fire from fortified emplacements. This close cooperation between infantry and armor was a tactical complexity that the Imperial Guard rarely managed to achieve with their own less reliable equipment and coordination. The Marines also mastered the use of portable field artillery and chemical mortars, allowing them to rapidly deploy indirect fire support even in the most rugged and inaccessible terrain. This continuous tactical evolution meant that by the time of later battles, the Marine defense was virtually immune to the predictable Imperial Guard counter-assaults. Every new Japanese defensive innovation was met with an immediate, technologically superior, and often brutally effective American counter-tactic. The Imperial Guard's tactical stagnation, driven by its adherence to outdated offensive doctrines, sealed its fate against a foe that was constantly learning and innovating under fire. The Marine lines became an ever-changing, deadly defensive system, capable of repelling any attack and then instantly pivoting to a destructive counter-offensive. The ultimate reason the Japanese Imperial Guard could not break the Marine lines lies in the vast and unbridgeable chasm between the two forces' material and doctrinal foundations. The Japanese were fighting a war of spirit and willpower, relying on individual sacrifice to compensate for a catastrophic lack of industrial resources. The Americans were fighting a war of industry and engineering, relying on overwhelming logistical superiority to ensure victory with minimal, though still significant, cost. The Imperial Guard's offensive doctrine was a relic of a bygone era, emphasizing the bayonet charge in a war dominated by the machine gun and high explosive. The Marine defensive doctrine was a modern synthesis of combined arms, where infantry, armor, artillery, and air power functioned as a single, coordinated, and irresistible destructive unit. Every Marine position was backed by an industrial power that could replace losses and replenish ammunition faster than the Japanese could inflict casualties. The Japanese were operating at the extreme end of a broken supply chain, often facing battle with insufficient food, water, and vital medicine. This material abyss was compounded by a philosophical one, where the Imperial Guard's commitment to death before dishonor prevented the tactical adaptability necessary for survival. The Marines, guided by pragmatism and a focus on mission accomplishment, were able to withdraw, reorganize, and adapt their plans instantly to counter any threat. The failure of the Imperial Guard was not a failure of courage, it was the inevitable conclusion when human ferocity collides with the full, sustained power of a modern industrial state. The battles proved that in the age of total war, the strongest spiritual conviction could not stop a steady stream of M1 Garand fire or a coordinated naval bombardment. The Marine lines were unbreakable because they were anchored by the output of American factories, the ingenuity of their engineers, and a doctrine that prized firepower and flexibility over rigid honor. The history of these clashes serves as a chilling testament to the decisive power of logistics and combined arms doctrine in dictating the course of modern warfare.